What you'll hear next wouldn't be possible without the support of readers, viewers, and listeners like you. In organizations such as the Berlin Science Week, New York City Economic Development Corporation, Rita Allen Foundation, and the Civic Science Media Lab. Visit civicsciencemedia.org to learn more.
Welcome to Consider This Next on Civic Sci Radio. I'm your host, Kacie Luaders. Here on the show, we connect with diverse voices across the civic science landscape. Scholars, practitioners, and leaders shaping the intersections of science within our society. Our mission? To uncover lessons from their work and translate them into actionable insights. Like all programs from the Civic Science Media Lab, whether on video, radio, or digital print, Consider This Next is here to keep decision makers, from researchers and practitioners to local community members, informed, inspired, and equipped with the latest insights. Welcome to a new season of Consider This Next, where we explore the intersection of science, storytelling, and society. I'm your host, Kacie Luaders, and this season, we're continuing to examine the world of civic science communication, looking at how scientific knowledge shapes our communities and how communities shape our understanding of science. We often think of science communication as a one-way street, experts talking down to the public from that proverbial ivory tower. But what happens when we flip that script? When we create spaces where scientists and non-scientists alike can share their personal experiences with science through the age-old art of storytelling. Today, we're speaking with Emma Yarbrough, senior producer for Story Collider in Atlanta. Story Collider is transforming how we think about science communication, one personal story at a time. Through their live shows and popular podcast, they're proving that everyone, from PhD researchers to everyday citizens, has a science story worth telling. Okay, so today we are talking to Emma Yarbrough, who is a senior producer for Story Collider based in Atlanta. Emma, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Kacie. I'm excited.
Of course. And so I would love to know the beginning, the origin story. How did you get involved with the Story Collider organization?
I really sort of fell backwards into it. The Story Collider had been doing one show every year in Atlanta during the Atlanta Science Festival for many years. And they had decided to expand to having more regular shows in Atlanta, and they wanted to have home stage producers. So, generally speaking, they look for scientists, people within the field, science communicators, but they also reach out to artists in the community and stand ups, storytellers, theater performers who have that experience so that, the producers have access to a wider swath of community members. So, my dear friend, Dr. Kelly Vinyl, when she found out that they were looking for Atlanta producers, she reached out and interviewed with them. And they asked her, like, do you know anybody who maybe has more of an arts background that would be interested in doing this? And she said, I just might have the person. And, sort of it was kismet because I had just performed maybe my first personal narrative on stage. And I was coming off of a sort of obsessive deep dive in storytelling podcast. So it was such a cool opportunity, for that door to open up.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what Story Collider does and what their mission is?
Absolutely. So, Story Collider is an organization that is dedicated to the art of personal, true stories about science. We have a weekly podcast that puts out two stories every week. And the stories are collected from our live shows that happen all over the country, actually, all over the world. We have some shows that happen in England and, all over the place. And just like kind of the moth or the way that's set up, there are these individual cities that then are culled together, or the best stories from the individual city shows are put out through the podcast. That's the show arm of what we do. We have another arm, which is education. So in addition to producing these shows and, hosting the shows, the storyteller producers also work teaching workshops for storytelling and coaching storytellers. And those can be private workshops where a college, a university, a lab reaches out to us and they want us to come in and teach them how to go about storytelling within their field, or public workshops, which anybody can sign up for. And those happen on a relatively regular basis. I should say storycollider.org if you want to find out where you can take a workshop. So, yeah, that's kind of the two pronged side or the two sides of what Story Collider does.
Can you walk us through your process when you are curating a live show for Story Collider? Where do you find your storytellers? How do you determine your mix of folks who are formally trained in science versus folks who are just telling a story about science? How does that process work for you?
I feel like I'm always looking for storytellers, and I feel like my producers are the same way, and we find them anywhere. Anytime I meet someone that is, a writer for stage or something like that, I will often get into a conversation about storytelling because I always get into conversations about storytelling with folks like that. And that will sometimes end with me discovering that they have an incredible story that relates to science. When articles are put out about scientists at universities in the area, I keep an eye on stuff like that. My co-producers and myself, we're constantly like sending each other podcast episodes or tweet threads that we see. And we're like, what about this person? What about this person? And so we're always on the lookout for, like you said, we try to keep a really good mix of scientists and non-scientists telling stories because part of our ethos is that science is for everyone. So you don't have to have a doctorate to have a really compelling story about science.
Who would you say in Atlanta are some of your key partners when it comes to either promoting Story Collider events, helping to find folks? Are there any like key organizations that you routinely partner with?
Absolutely. So we are actually partnered for, every show with Science ATL, which is the nonprofit organization that runs the Atlanta Science Festival. They have come on as our sponsor. I think probably it started last year. And so they have this incredible network of people. The Atlanta Science Festival is 2 weeks of just like hundreds of events. It's a very well loved festival here in Atlanta. And so our partnership with them has been so wonderful. We've done shows during Atlanta Science Festival. Like I said, before Atlanta was even a home show city, we would have shows in the Atlanta Science Festival. So, in a way, the Story Collider partnership with the Atlanta Science Festival and Science ATL has lasted longer than the Story Collider's partnership with the city of Atlanta. Yeah. And then other than that, we have had some one-offs. We've done shows at the Center for Civic and Human Rights. We have an upcoming show with Trees Atlanta. I work at Emory, and my co-producer, one of them is an Emory grad who she got her PhD from Emory. So that is obviously a spot where we can find a lot of storytellers, but my co-producer, so there are 3 producers in Atlanta. One is, as I mentioned, Dr. Kelly Beinel, who graduated from Emory, and then the other one is Dr. Mesa Salida, who actually founded the Atlanta Science Festival. So there is literally nobody as tapped into the science community in Atlanta as Mesa. And so, yeah, we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to finding partners and storytellers and getting the word out about our shows.
What are some of the challenges when it comes to either, like, say you find a scientist or someone with a science background who, like, like, oh, you can tell a story or you can communicate this thing that I read about in a way
Mhm.
that maybe they're not sure that they can do it, and vice versa. Someone who may not have a science background, who, for whatever reason, you're like, you have a science story that you can tell even if you don't think that you can do it? How do you overcome those
Mm.
challenges and help to coach those people into performing for Story Collider?
I think the answer, well, of course, there are multiple challenges, but one challenge that's shared on both sides of the coin is imposter syndrome. People come in thinking that they need to be a professional stand up comedian who's got this perfect story about science, is going to be educational and funny and make you cry. And they're coming to us with their, everyday stories about life and saying, nobody who's going to want to listen to this. Nobody wants to hear me talk about myself. And I always say, well, if we didn't listen to people, interpreting their lives through artwork, then we would have no art. Yes, that is art. So on the science side of things, I think that there is a reluctance among scientists to talk about failure. And I think that that's kind of a result of the highly competitive nature of science funding. So we often are having to really kind of pull out those details about when things didn't go right and vulnerability, which those pieces of a story are what really allow your audience to feel like they can connect to you, because we're all so full of faults and mistakes. But in the end, those vulnerabilities are the connection points with our audience. And the stories that tell these messy experiences in the lab or out in the field are the ones that we hear time and time again audiences are connecting to the most. I also get to play the dummy. My other co-producers have doctorates. I am not a scientist. I did not, I took my one lab science class at a community college, so I didn't have to take it at my university and got out of that world as quickly as possible. So, a big role that I play in our producing team is I just am like, explain this to me like I'm a kindergartner. Like, how can you pare down what you're saying to the essence? So that's what I would say is the challenge with scientists, both overcoming the desire to put out a perfect front, and also helping escort them into the world of talking to the everyday person about science instead of talking to their peers. And then, yeah, with non-scientists, they're always just like, I don't belong on a science storytelling podcast. I don't have any science stories. And I'm like, absolutely, you have science stories. Do you have a story about a health event? Do you have a story about a weather event? Do you have a story about your ninth grade science class, a project that you did one time? Mental health. There are so many ways that science is a part of any human living on this world's life that I am pretty confident I could find a science story out of most anybody I talk to. So those are the main challenges, I think, when first approaching and working with storytellers.
Why do you think that having events like Story Collider, where audiences can come and experience either a scientist telling a story or a non scientist telling a science related story, why is that important for community building, for a different style of learning? What are some of the ways that you think the Story Collider helps to build communities?
That's funny. We were just discussing this among all of the producers, what it is that our shows, what we as producers experience in our shows, and what we see audience members getting out of our storytelling shows. And my initial thought, the thing that I noticed the most is at the beginning of a show, when the audience comes in, everybody's talking to the person that they came with. At the end of the show, they're in groups of 10 or 12. There's usually a storyteller in the group. There's laughter. All of a sudden, these strangers become friends. And we are always like, okay, guys, we got to go home now. It's like they don't want to leave. And there's this sort of creation of intimacy in such a quick time. Our shows are 2 hours, and to have an audience go from complete strangers to people who feel like they've experienced something moving and life-changing together, through hearing someone be so brave and tell their story is just every time I'm always just so blown away and so grateful that I get to be a part of making building that community. And in the larger sense of things, I think a huge benefit to the Story Collider and the work that we do is, we are currently in a time where there is a pretty, let's say, a war on truth and misinformation and disinformation. And the way people are getting their information, the way people are learning things is all through, our phones. And there are benefits to that, certainly, but the ability to be able to look a person in the eye and hear them tell their personal experience, it humanizes science and it makes it seem like a little bit less of this lofty, ivory tower, inaccessible field and something that the average person can relate to and understand. And that builds trust. And trust is huge when we're talking about sharing information, and building community.
We are in a rather polarizing time. There are science related topics that are becoming more and more politicized, and folks are getting information from all sorts of places. And so, I guess almost just to dig a little bit deeper in your last answer, like, why is humanizing the sciences something that is beneficial to not just folks who are interested in science, but for helping to perhaps create a channel for information that is coming from a reliable source, but also, as you said, doesn't feel like, oh, I'm being lectured to. I don't
Mhm.
understand this jargon.
Mhm.
I'm connecting with this story.
Totally. The first thing I'd say is that it really cannot be overstated the power of narrative and how our brain processes narrative. We were spreading oral histories over the campfire for hundreds of years, maybe I mean, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I don't know the timeline, but I know we were doing that for a lot longer than the written word. The written word came in pretty late in the game. And so our brains have actually evolved to take on information, understand information by putting it within the context of a narrative, of a story shape. We are born with this capacity to understand the way stories work and to immediately sort of glean from a story the information that you need to have. So I think, yeah, evolutionarily, we're built to share information this way. There is another at the Story Collider, we use a lot of studies because scientists love studies to back up our work. And one of the studies that we often cite in our workshops is a study by social psychologists Susan Fiske and Sydney Dupree. And it is a research conducted on the concept of warmth as a key dimension in how people perceive and believe different groups. On a graph that, in one direction we have competence and incompetence. And in, that's your x-axis. And then the y-axis was warm to cold. And so the people that we trust are the people that fall into the warm and competent. And traditionally, that is teachers, that is religious leaders, that is, therapists in some cases. Traditionally, with the scientists and, other professions, that is in the competence and, cool, lack of warmth quadrant, we'll say. And not only do we not trust people in that quadrant, but they, set up this study where they had electrodes on people's faces and were showing them videos. And when they showed them a video of something negative happening to someone that fell within that quadrant, that person's perceived that person as someone who was competent yet cool, the subjects in the study smiled. They're actively rooting against people because there's this feeling of, oh, that person thinks, I mean, we can opine that there's this idea that that person thinks they're better than me, they're looking down on me, I'm intimidated. And so, yeah, I mean, humanizing people, making them seem like science, showing that scientists are people, that scientists do have passions, they have vulnerabilities, they make mistakes, and they are passionate about the work that they do. The scientists that I've seen are some of the most passionate people I have ever come across in their field. And the way that we kind of spread information within the science world doesn't often show that. And so it's not allowing people to see scientists not only as experts, but as fellow humans. And we aren't going to trust people unless we believe they're fellow humans.
What a great way to wrap the segment here. Well, yes, thank you so much for coming on to tell us your story about being a civic science communicator. And if folks wanted to learn more either about the Story Collider podcast, if they want to learn how they can get involved in their cities, if they want to learn more about Story Collider Atlanta, all the things, where should they go?
They should go to storycollider.org. That's where you'll find out about classes and shows, live shows and workshops and all that good stuff. And for the podcast, just wherever you find podcasts, the Story Collider, we're out there.
Today's conversation with Emma illuminated how storytelling can transform the way we share and understand science. As you reflect on the power of personal narratives in science communication, consider this next. How might you incorporate storytelling into your own work with science? Think about the moments of vulnerability, curiosity, or discovery that could help others connect with scientific concepts. What personal experiences could you share to make science more accessible? When engaging with scientific information, how can you create space for both expertise and lived experience? Consider ways to acknowledge and value different forms of knowledge while maintaining scientific integrity. If you're a scientist or researcher, how might you break down the barriers between your work and your community? Could you find opportunities to share not just your findings, but the human journey that led to them? And finally, reflect on the role of trust in science communication. How could sharing personal stories help bridge the gap between scientific institutions and the communities they serve? Before we sign off, I'd like to offer a big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in and engaging with these crucial topics. If you found value in this podcast, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. Your support helps us continue to bring you insightful conversations like this one. Until next time, keep nurturing your curiosity and stay connected to the science all around you. This is Kacie Luaders, signing off from Consider This Next on Civic Sci Radio. Stay curious.